I arrived home to find strangers sitting at my father's dining table. A woman I had never seen before was sipping from my mother's favorite china cup, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. A young man and a girl, both in their early 20s, sat beside her, their eyes gleaming with something between arrogance and triumph. I was gone for only 6 months. 6 months. Yet, in my absence, my so-called family had rewritten the entire story of my life. Ah, finally. My father leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "You're back, just in time." I didn't miss the condescending glance he exchanged with my mother, the way she barely hid her irritation at my return, the way the 3 strangers looked at me as if I were an inconvenience, a temporary occupant of what was already theirs. I placed my keys on the marble counter, my fingers tightening around them. Just in time for what? My father cleared his throat, putting on his best understanding parent act. "Well, we have some changes to discuss. You see, I've been reflecting a lot on my family, on what it means to truly embrace our own." I cocked an eyebrow, already knowing where this was going. My mother took over, her voice sweet, yet sharp as a dagger. "You always knew our marriage was a partnership, dear. We both had our own lives. And sometimes life brings unexpected surprises." Her gaze flickered toward the woman at the table, the woman who, without a hint of hesitation, stood and extended her hand. "I'm Evelyn," she introduced herself, as if that name should mean something to me. "Your father's, let's say, first love, and these," she gestured to the young man and woman beside her, "are our children." I didn't shake her hand. I didn't blink. I didn't speak, because I was too busy calculating. They thought I would break, that I would scream, demand answers, maybe even storm out like a helpless, rejected son. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. I stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, meeting each of their gazes with a cold, unshaken stare. Then I smiled. "Is that so? Let the games begin." I leaned against the marble counter, my arms crossed, watching them with an unreadable expression. My father shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with my silence. My mother, ever the poised manipulator, took a slow sip of her wine, gauging my reaction. They were waiting for an outburst, a reaction. They weren't going to get one. I had learned a long time ago that in this house, emotions were a weakness. I had been raised in a war zone disguised as a mansion where love was currency, loyalty was conditional, and power was the only thing that mattered. My father, Richard, was the CEO of one of the largest real estate empires in the country. He wasn't a self-made man. He had inherited everything from my grandfather, and still, he carried himself like a king, like every success was his doing. My mother, Vivian, was no less ruthless. She came from old money, a family that valued image over everything. Their marriage was never about love. It was an alliance, a business merger in the form of vows. I was the only child they had together, the one legitimate heir, the son raised by my grandfather, the only person who had ever shown me what true power meant. Before he died, he left his company shares and fortune to me, bypassing my father completely. He knew who deserved to carry his legacy. My parents had always resented that, but they never dared to move against me until now. And now they were telling me I had siblings. I studied the 2 newcomers, The young man, Lucas, looked confident, too confident. He had my father's sharp features, but none of his discipline. He lounged back in his chair, arms draped casually over the armrests, his smirk just a little too forced. He thought he had already won. The girl, Celeste, had my mother's striking beauty, but none of her restraint. She played with the edge of the linen napkin on her lap, but her eyes kept darting to me, filled with something between curiosity and apprehension. She wasn't as sure of herself as her brother, but she was still here, sitting in my place at the table. And then there was Evelyn, the woman who claimed to be my father's first love. She had aged gracefully, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a quiet calculation. She wasn't here for sentiment. She was here for power. I finally let out a small chuckle, shaking my head as I pushed away from the counter. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my voice casual but firm. "You've spent years pretending I was your only child. You made it clear you never wanted more. But the second I step away to handle my own affairs, suddenly, these two show up?" My father exhaled sharply. "It's more complicated than that." "No," I cut him off smoothly. "It's not. It's actually quite simple. You want to replace me." A thick silence settled over the room. For a second, no one spoke. Then Lucas laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Man, you really think everything revolves around you, huh?" he said, leaning forward. "You left. You didn't want to be part of this family. You made it easy for us." I tilted my head slightly, my smile never faltering. "I don't remember leaving the family. I remember stepping away from the toxicity." "That's different." My mother sighed, feigning exhaustion. "Oh, stop being dramatic. This is about unifying the family, not replacing you." I turned my gaze to her, my smile widening. "Unifying the family? Interesting." I gestured toward Evelyn. "And what role does she play in this little family reunion?" Evelyn finally spoke, her voice smooth and practiced. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I simply want my children to have what they deserve." "And what exactly do you think they deserve?" She didn't even hesitate. "A share of the company. A rightful place in this family. Recognition." Ah, there it was. I let out a low chuckle. "So that's what this is. You didn't bring them here out of love. You brought them here to claim what isn't yours." Lucas scoffed. "You act like you're the only one who has a right to anything. What, just because you were born first?" "No," I said calmly. "Because I'm the only one who earned it." My father slammed his hand down on the table. "Enough!" For the first time, I saw the frustration in his face, the anger. He had expected me to be caught off guard, maybe even shaken. He had expected me to react like a child losing his toys, but I wasn't a child, and this wasn't their game anymore. My mother placed a gentle hand on my father's wrist, pacifying him before turning back to me. "There's no need to be hostile. We just want to discuss some adjustments." Adjustments. I already knew what that meant. They wanted me to step down. To give up my inheritance, my company shares my place at the table, and in return, they would offer me nothing. I smiled. Oh, how naive they were. "Adjustments," I repeated, rolling the word over my tongue like I was tasting it. "All right." For the first time, they looked relieved, mistaking my calmness for surrender. I let the silence stretch just long enough to let them believe they had won. Then I slowly walked over to the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had always been mine, and pulled it out. I sat down, crossed my legs, folded my hands on the table, and then I met their gazes one by one, my smile turning sharper, colder. Let's discuss those adjustments then. They thought they had planned for every possible reaction, but they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The air in the dining room was thick with tension. No one moved, no one spoke. My father's fingers twitched against the table. My mother's grip on her wineglass tightened just slightly, and Evelyn's polite smile was starting to falter. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his smirk more forced than before, while Celeste kept her gaze low, as if she suddenly didn't want to be here. They expected me to lash out, to argue, to fight back like a desperate man clinging to a sinking ship. But I wasn't desperate. I was just getting started. My father cleared his throat, forcing authority into his voice. Since you're open to discussing adjustments, let's be practical about this. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. By all means. His lips pressed together in irritation before he continued. Your grandfather left the majority of his company shares to you, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly fair. My eyebrow twitched. Fair? He ignored my tone and pushed on. At the time, we respected his decision, but things have changed. The business needs unity, and having all the power concentrated in one person's hands is problematic. Translation? They didn't like that they couldn't control me. For a second, no one spoke. Then Lucas laughed under his breath, shaking his head. Man, you really think everything revolves around you, huh? He said, leaning forward. You left. You didn't want to be part of this family. You made it easy for us. I tilted my head slightly, my smile never faltering. I don't remember leaving the family. I remember stepping away from the toxicity. That's different. My mother sighed, feigning exhaustion. Oh, stop being dramatic. This is about unifying the family, not replacing you. I turned my gaze to her, my smile widening. Unifying the family? Interesting. I gestured towards Evelyn. And what role does she play in this little family reunion? Evelyn finally spoke, her voice smooth and practiced. I'm not here to take anything from you. I simply want my children to have what they deserve. And what exactly do you think they deserve? She didn't even hesitate. A share of the company, a rightful place in this family, recognition. Ah, there it was. I let out a low chuckle. So that's what this is. You didn't bring them here out of love. You brought them here to claim what isn't yours. Lucas scoffed. You act like you're the only one who has a right to anything. What? Just because you were born first? No, I said calmly, because I'm the only one who earned it. My father slammed his hand down on the table. Enough! For the first time, I saw the frustration in his face, the anger. He had expected me to be caught off guard, maybe even shaken. He had expected me to react like a child losing his toys, but I wasn't a child. And this wasn't their game anymore. My mother placed a gentle hand on my father's wrist, pacifying him before turning back to me. There's no need to be hostile. We just want to discuss some adjustments. Adjustments. I already knew what that meant. They wanted me to step down, To give up my inheritance, my company shares my place at the table, and in return, they would offer me nothing. I smiled. Oh, how naive they were. Adjustments, I repeated, rolling the word over my tongue like I was tasting it. All right. For the first time, they looked relieved, mistaking my calmness for surrender. I let the silence stretch just long enough to let them believe they had won. Then I slowly walked over to the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had always been mine, and pulled it out. I sat down, crossed my legs, folded my hands on the table, and then I met their gazes one by one, my smile turning sharper, colder. Let's discuss those adjustments then. They thought they had planned for every possible reaction, but they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The air in the dining room was thick with tension. No one moved, no one spoke. My father's fingers twitched against the table, my mother's grip on her wine glass tightened just slightly, and Evelyn's polite smile was starting to falter. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his smirk more forced than before, while Celeste kept her gaze low, as if she suddenly didn't want to be here. They expected me to lash out, to argue, to fight back like a desperate man clinging to a sinking ship. But I wasn't desperate. I was just getting started. My father cleared his throat, forcing authority into his voice. Since you're open to discussing adjustments, let's be practical about this. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. By all means. His lips pressed together in irritation before he continued. Your grandfather left the majority of his company shares to you, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly fair. My eyebrow twitched. Fair? He ignored my tone and pushed on. At the time, we respected his decision, but things have changed. The business needs unity, and having all the power concentrated in one person's hands is problematic. Translation? They didn't like that they couldn't control me. Not that I ever truly belonged to them, but hearing it spoken aloud, watching them toss me aside as if I were just an inconvenience, was something else entirely. For years I had known this family was built on nothing but lies, manipulation, and convenience. I had watched my parents play their political games, using people like chess pieces, always ensuring they were the ones in control. And yet, a small, irrational part of me had once believed they wouldn't dare turn against their own blood. I scoffed at my own foolishness. They never saw me as their son. I was only ever an obstacle. I shoved open the door to my study, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind me. The cold glow of the city skyline through the glass windows did little to ground me. My fingers curled into fists as I exhaled slowly, willing the storm inside me to settle. I wasn't angry. No, anger was too simple, too fleeting. I was something far colder, calculated, determined, dangerous. They thought they could push me out of my own legacy. They thought they could erase me, replace me with two strangers who had done nothing to earn what was mine. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated me. A knock at the door. Light, hesitant. I didn't turn. Come in. The door creaked open, and a familiar voice spoke softly. I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk. Celeste. I glanced over my shoulder to find her standing just inside the doorway, her hands clasped together. Unlike her mother and brother, she looked uncertain, nervous even. I studied her in silence for a moment before turning back toward the window. If you're here to convince me to hand everything over, you're wasting your time. She flinched. That's not why I came. I arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. She hesitated before stepping further inside, her voice quieter now. I don't agree with all of this, you know. I turned, my gaze sharp. Then why are you here? Why are you playing along? Her shoulders stiffened. Because I don't have a choice. I let out a slow exhale. There's always a choice. She let out a bitter laugh. Not for me, my mother. She's been planning this for years. Grooming Lucas to take over, pushing me to play the perfect supporting role. I was never meant to lead, never meant to have a say. Just a pawn in their game. I studied her carefully, watching the flickers of doubt in her expression. Was she lying, manipulating me, just like the rest of them, or was she telling the truth? She met my gaze hesitantly. Are you really going to fight them? A slow smirk curled at my lips. What do you think? She exhaled, shaking her head. You're going to burn them to the ground, aren't you? I tilted my head slightly. Only if they don't get out of my way. For a moment she said, nothing. Then, with a quiet breath, she turned to leave. But before she stepped out, she paused, gripping the doorframe. Be careful. I frowned slightly. Why? She hesitated. Because my mother, she's not just after the company. I narrowed my eyes. Then what does she want? Celeste swallowed hard, then finally whispered, everything. And with that, she disappeared into the hallway, leaving me standing there with a single thought running through my mind. If they wanted a war, they had just declared one. I barely slept that night, not because of anger. Anger was a fleeting, useless emotion, but because my mind was working through every possible move. Celeste's words echoed in my head. She's not just after the company. She wants everything. I wasn't sure if I trusted her yet, but I knew one thing. She wasn't lying about her mother. Evelyn wasn't just another scheming mistress hoping to secure a comfortable future for her children. She was playing the long game, and I needed to know exactly what that game was. By morning, I had already made my move. I sat at my desk, my laptop open, scrolling through the files my private investigator had sent me overnight. Bank transactions, offshore accounts, legal loopholes, all tied to Evelyn, and that's when I found it, a hidden clause in the company's bylaws. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Clever, ruthless, and entirely illegal. The document was old, buried deep in corporate filings, something my father and mother had never expected me to find. But Evelyn? She had found it. It stated that if I were deemed unfit to lead, either due to mental incompetence or legal incapacity, the board would have the right to vote on a replacement. A replacement handpicked by my parents. They weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to frame me. A slow, humorless chuckle left my lips. They were going to use my own company's laws against me. That was why they weren't panicking. Why? My father had been so confident when he said the decision was already made. They didn't need my signature at all. They just needed to make sure I was out of the way, and I had no doubt they had already begun laying the groundwork. The subtle rumors, the carefully planted doubts about my ability to lead. Maybe they would claim I had a history of reckless spending, erratic behavior. Maybe they would leak falsified reports of poor business decisions, frame me as unstable, dangerous, unfit. And once the board voted me out, everything would belong to them. I closed my laptop, my mind eerily calm. So this was their move. Fine. Now, it was my turn. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again, I smirked. Well, I figured if anyone knew how to destroy a man from the inside out, it'd be you. A pause. Then a low chuckle. I assume this is about your dear family? They made their move, I said, standing up, gazing out the window at the empire my grandfather built. Now it's time for me. I turned, my eyes cold. If they wanted to declare me unfit to lead, I'd make sure they weren't fit to stand. The board meeting was set for noon. By 10, the rumors had already begun circulating. There's concern about his leadership. His financial decisions have been questionable. Did you hear about the incident last year? I heard he had issues. Fabricated whispers, planted doubts, all carefully orchestrated to destroy my credibility. I stood at the top floor of the company's headquarters, watching from the glass window as the vultures gathered below. Board members, executives, legal advisors, each one carefully manipulated into believing they were about to witness the fall of an unstable heir. They had no idea they were walking into my game. I turned away from the window, my expression unreadable as my assistant walked in. Sir, they're all in the conference room. Your father is already seated. Your mother and Evelyn arrived 15 minutes ago. Lucas looks confident. Of course he did. He thought he was about to be crowned. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit, my movements slow, deliberate. And Celeste? She hasn't said a word to anyone. Interesting. She was still a wild card, but I had more important things to focus on. I straightened my tie, exhaling softly. It was time. When I walked into the conference room, all conversation ceased. 17 pairs of eyes turned to me, scanning, analyzing, waiting for the broken, cornered heir. I didn't give them one. Instead, I walked to the head of the table, placed my hands on the polished wood, and smiled. Shall we begin? My father cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral. But I saw it. The tightness in his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers. He was waiting for my downfall. Vivian. And Evelyn sat to his left, exuding quiet confidence. Lucas leaned back in his chair, already looking comfortable in the position he believed was about to be handed to him. I took my seat. The chairman, an older man with sharp eyes, nodded. We have a matter of great importance to discuss today. There have been concerns about your leadership, concerns planted by my own family, I cut in smoothly. The room stiffened. The chairman sighed. The board has reviewed several reports indicating reports that were fabricated, I interrupted again. I leaned forward, letting my gaze sweep across the room. And before we go any further, I'd like to ask a simple question. Silence. I smiled. Then I dropped the bombshell. Who authorized the sale of company shares to Evelyn's offshore accounts? The reaction was immediate. My father's eyes widened. Evelyn's fingers twitched. Lucas sat up straighter. My mother, always, the best at masking emotion, remained still, but her grip on her pen tightened. The chairman frowned. What are you talking about? I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. I had an audit conducted on company transactions over the past year. Imagine my surprise when I found that large sums had been funneled into overseas accounts directly linked to Evelyn and Lucas. Lucas's smirk vanished. "That's ridiculous," my father snapped. I turned to him, tilting my head. "Is it? Because I have documents proving otherwise." The chairman opened the folder, scanning the papers with narrowed eyes. The room grew tenser by the second. I leaned back. "You weren't trying to replace me in the company. You were planning to strip it apart from the inside, sell off assets, move the money offshore, then leave the rest to burn while you disappear." "With the fortune," Evelyn finally spoke, her voice cool and composed. "Those accusations are absurd," I chuckled. "Are they?" I nodded to the doors. They opened, and in walked my private investigator, followed by 2 federal agents. Evelyn's composure cracked just slightly. Lucas paled. My father exhaled through his nose, his mind already racing for an escape. I gestured lazily toward them. "They'd be happy to explain just how deep the fraud runs." The chairman turned to my father, his voice sharp. "Richard, is this true?" My father opened his mouth. Then I closed it. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. Lucas stood abruptly. "This is a setup." I arched an eyebrow. "Funny. That's what people say when they've been caught." The chairman closed the folder. His voice was firm, final. "Effective immediately, Richard and Evelyn are removed from any decision-making capacities. We will conduct an internal review, and if necessary, legal action will follow." Lucas turned to my father, but for once, my father had nothing to say. I stood, adjusting my cuffs. Meeting adjourned. I walked out without looking back. The war was over, and I had won. The moment I stepped out of the conference room, I took a deep breath. The air felt different, lighter, clearer, freer. I had spent my entire life being the pawn in their game, waiting for the moment they would finally turn on me completely. And now I had done the one thing they never thought I could do. I had outplayed them all. The sounds of hurried whispers and frantic phone calls echoed down the hall as company executives scrambled to process what had just happened. I walked past them, unfazed. My focus was elsewhere. Celeste was waiting by the elevator. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "You knew," she said softly. I glanced at her. "About offshore accounts?" "No," I smirked. "But I knew your mother was planning something, and I knew my father was too arrogant to realize she wasn't just using me. She was using him too." Celeste exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Lucas is going to hate you for this." "Lucas was always going to hate me," I said simply. "At least now he has a reason." She didn't argue. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside, but just before the doors closed, she spoke again. "Are you going to destroy them completely?" I studied her for a moment. "What do you think?" Celeste hesitated, then shook her head with a small, knowing smile. "No." "You'll leave them with just enough rope to hang themselves." "Smart girl." I didn't reply as the doors shut. By the time I reached my office, my assistant was already waiting with a fresh report. "Sir, The board has requested a full financial review of every department. They also want to know if you'd like to press charges against Richard and Evelyn. I sat behind my desk, exhaling slowly. I had everything I wanted. My parents were disgraced. Lucas and Evelyn were exposed. The company was mine, and no one could challenge me now. So why didn't it feel like victory? I tapped my fingers against the desk, my mind already working. Pressing charges would mean years of legal battles, public trials, endless drama. And that's exactly what they wanted. My father wasn't the type to accept defeat. He was the type to drag everyone down with him. If I pushed him into a corner, he'd fight until there was nothing left to fight for. I wouldn't let him have that satisfaction. Tell the board we won't pursue legal action, for now, I said. But we're cutting all financial ties. With Richard and Evelyn, no access to company accounts, no severance, nothing. My assistant nodded, taking notes. And Lucas? I smirked. Let him try to survive on his own for once. He wouldn't last a month. Later that evening, I returned to the estate. It was eerily quiet. The servants avoided eye contact. The house, once filled with the constant tension of power struggles, now felt empty. I found my father in his study, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his throne. He didn't look up as I entered. They turned on me, he muttered. The board, the executives, everyone. I leaned against the doorway. That's what happens when you back the wrong horse. He finally looked at me, his eyes tired but still burning with defiance. You think you've won? I tilted my head. Haven't I? He scoffed. You might control the company, but you don't control power. That's something you still don't understand. I smiled, slow and knowing. I understand perfectly. I turned to leave, pausing only to glance back at him. The difference between us, Father? You built your power on fear and manipulation. My gaze hardened. I built mine on something that can't be taken away. And what's that? He sneered. I smirked. Competence. I walked away, leaving him alone in his ruined kingdom. That night, as I stood in my grandfather's old study, I finally let myself breathe. The war was over. For the first time, I wasn't fighting to survive. I was ruling, and God help anyone who tried to take it from me.